Non-nonsense by the book, Commander. So when Captain Rorik, the human liaison, casually mentioned that one of his operatives had gone missing in the Drawn Ridge, THX was more than a little concerned. You're saying this operative went missing 5 days ago? THX's voice was a low growl as he stared down Rorik, his 4 eyes narrowing. And you haven't sent a retrieval team? The ridge is crawling with hostiles. Rorik shrugged, completely unfazed. Relax, Colonel. Our operative will be fine. THX's mandibles clicked in frustration. The Drawn Ridge is a death trap. Even my best squads struggle there. This operative of yours, what was he doing there in the first place? Rorik leaned back in his chair, his expression almost bored. Classified recon mission. You know the drill. But trust me, he's not your average soldier. THX's eyes flickered with irritation. No soldier is average in this war. But what makes him so special that you're not concerned? A small smile tugged at Rorik's lips as he tapped a few commands into his data pad. Let's just say he's a specialist in unconventional warfare. Name's Kale Shadowstrike. Part of an old Terran program, classified of course. Not just any soldier, Colonel. He's a shadow operative. THX's clawed fingers twitched involuntarily toward his plasma pistol. Shadow operative? Rorik's eyes gleamed as he continued. Kale was trained to operate behind enemy lines, alone, with no support. He can disappear into the landscape, become a ghost, blend in so well that even the terrain forgets him. He's an expert in sabotage, guerrilla tactics, and survival. He doesn't just survive, Colonel, he thrives. The Colonel felt a cold shiver run down his spine, something he hadn't experienced in decades of service. What exactly are you saying, Captain? I'm saying, Rorik's tone was calm but carried an edge, that Kale isn't missing. He's hunting. Anyone foolish enough to cross his path will regret it. THX opened his mandibles to respond but was interrupted by an incoming transmission. The communication officer, clearly disturbed, handed him the earpiece. Colonel, you need to hear this. THX listened in silence as reports came in from the Drawn Ridge. Entire squads of hostile Drawn marauders had been found slaughtered, their encampments destroyed, supplies vanished. The enemy was in full retreat, and not a single shot had been fired by the Zyran forces. Only one name was whispered among the survivors, the Ghost of Drawn Ridge. THX's grip tightened on his pistol as he realized the truth. Kale Shadowstrike wasn't just a soldier, he was a force of nature, a nightmare given form. The Colonel finally understood why Rorik had been so calm. Where is Kale now? THX asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Rorik's smile widened. On his way back to our base. His job is done. THX looked out across the desolate landscape of the Drawn Ridge on the monitor, still seeing the ghostly aftermath of what Kale had done. What did he leave behind? Rorik's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. A message. THX's eyes widened as he saw the footage. The bodies of the enemy commanders were impaled on spikes, their faces twisted in terror. Kale's message was clear, no enemy was safe, no matter where they hid. The Colonel turned back to Rorik, who was already preparing to leave. I hope for all our sakes that Kale never turns against us. Rorik's final words echoed in the command center as he walked out. Don't worry, Colonel. As long as you're on the right side, you have nothing to fear. But if you're not, well, even the shadows have their own justice. Part 2. Colonel THX could barely process what he had seen. The efficiency, the brutality, Kale Shadowstrike was unlike anything he had encountered. The screen before him flickered, showing the aftermath of the carnage once more, as the communications officer nervously shuffled behind him. Colonel, there are more reports coming in. They're finding more. THX slowly turned to face the officer. More? The young Zyran nodded, his eyes wide with something akin to fear. Yes, sir. We've intercepted enemy communications. They're in full panic mode. They're abandoning the entire ridge. Some of them are saying they saw their comrades moving even after death. THX felt his stomach tighten. Show me. The officer patched in the intercepted footage. The grainy images revealed what looked like fallen Drawn soldiers, but they were standing, propped up in gruesome displays, as if Kale had turned them into grotesque marionettes to spread terror. The living among the enemy forces were firing wildly into the night, shooting at shadows, abandoning their positions in chaos. THX slammed his fist on the console. Enough. Get me Captain Rorik, now. Rorik appeared on the screen within moments, his calm demeanor unchanged. Colonel THX, what can I do for you? You didn't tell me about this, THX hissed, gesturing to the images on the screen. This is more than just combat tactics. This is psychological warfare of the most extreme kind. My troops, they need to be prepared if he ever turns. Rorik sighed and rubbed his temples. Colonel, I told you everything you needed to know. Kale was sent in to do exactly what he's doing, break the enemy's will, make them fear the shadows, fear the night. He's doing his job. But the cost, THX began. The cost, Rorik interrupted, is less than what we would have paid if the Dron had maintained control of that ridge. You know as well as I do that they were planning a major offensive. Kale has averted that, almost single-handedly. Would you rather your soldiers had faced the full brunt of that attack? THX couldn't argue with the logic, but something still gnawed at him. What happens when Kale returns? Will he reintegrate with his unit, with normal soldiers? Rorik's eyes darkened slightly. Kale is not meant for normal duty. He'll be debriefed, evaluated, and then likely sent on another mission, wherever we need him most. He's a tool, Colonel. A very precise, very dangerous tool. But rest assured, he's on our side. THX leaned back, feeling the weight of command settle heavier on his shoulders. And if he ever decides not to be? Rorik paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, Colonel, you and I will be having a very different conversation. But for now, that's not something you need to worry about. The screen went dark as Rorik signed off, leaving THX alone with his thoughts. He turned back to the battlefield footage, watching as the enemy forces scattered like frightened animals. The ghost of Dron Ridge had done his work well. Too well, perhaps. Kale's shadow strike moved silently through the remains of the Dron encampment, his every step deliberate and precise. He was already on the move to his next objective, a final sweep to ensure no enemy remnants lingered in the area. His mind was clear, his focus absolute. Every action he took was calculated to instill fear, to break the enemy's will to fight. As he made his way through the shattered landscape, he came upon a small group of Dron who had somehow survived the initial carnage. They were huddled together, their weapons discarded, eyes wide with terror as they saw him emerge from the shadows. Kale didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, taking them down with practiced efficiency, his blade flashing in the dim light. The last of the Dron tried to crawl away, but Kale caught him by the neck, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. The Dron gasped, his voice trembling, "Please, no more, we surrender." Kale's voice was cold, emotionless. "There is no surrender." With a swift motion, he ended the Dron's life, letting the body slump to the ground. He stood there for a moment, surveying the scene, ensuring that there were no more threats. Satisfied, he turned and began the long trek back to the staging point. As he moved, Kale activated his communicator. "This is Shadow Strike. Ridge is clear. Returning to base." The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Acknowledged, Shadow Strike. Transport is en route. ETA 2 hours." Kale nodded to himself and continued his march through the desolate landscape. His mission was complete, but the war was far from over. He knew that soon, very soon, he would be sent out again into the darkness to do what he did best. As he walked, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, the faces of those he had killed, the terror in their eyes. It was all necessary, all part of the mission. But deep down, in a place he rarely allowed himself to visit, he wondered if there would ever come a time when the mission was over, when he could finally stop being the ghost. But that time wasn't now. For now, there were more enemies to hunt, more missions to complete. Kale's Shadow Strike was a tool, a weapon, and weapons don't rest. As the transport ship descended from the sky, Kale looked up, his eyes narrowing. He would return to the shadows, to the places where only nightmares dared to tread. And there, in the darkness, he would wait for his next target.